A Book of Five Rings. By Miyamoto Musashi, 1645. Translated by Victor Harris, 1974. Modern English translation by ChatGPT 2023. Editor, Sir Adam S. Barnett. Note by the editor, Victor Harris's 1974 introduction has been moved to the epilogue. This is to allow the user to be directly immersed in the original author's writings. Introduction. After many years of training in the way of strategy, known as an I-10 Ichi Ryu, I have decided to explain it in writing for the first time. It is now the 10th month of the 20th year of Kanei, 1645, and I find myself on Mount Iwado in Higo, Kyushu, paying homage to heaven, praying to Kwannon, and kneeling before Buddha. I am Shinmen Musashi no Kami Fujiwara no Geshin, a warrior from Harima Province, 60 years of age. Since my youth, I have been drawn to the way of strategy. My first duel was at the age of 13 when I defeated a strategist from the Shinto school named Arima Kihei. At 16, I defeated another skilled strategist named Tadashima Akiyama. When I turned 21, I traveled to the capital and faced strategists from various schools, never once failing to emerge victorious. After that, I traveled from province to province, engaging in duels with strategists from different schools, and never once did I fail to win, even after having as many as 60 encounters. This period lasted from the ages of 13 to 28 or 29. When I turned 30, I reflected on my past victories and realized that they were not solely due to my mastery of strategy. It could have been natural talent, the will of heaven, or the inferiority of other schools' strategies. From that point on, I dedicated myself to studying morning and evening, searching for the underlying principle. It was not until I turned 50 that I truly grasped the way of strategy. Since then, I have lived without adhering to any particular way. With the virtue of strategy, I have practiced numerous arts and abilities, learning everything without a teacher. To write this book, I did not rely on the teachings of Buddha or Confucius, nor did I consult old war chronicles or books on martial tactics. I take up my brush to explain the true spirit of the Ichi school. The term wei, michi, in Japanese or do in Chinese refers to the entire life of a warrior, their devotion to the sword, and their place within the Confucian-influenced bureaucracy of the Tokugawa system. It encompasses the cosmic path, not just a set of ethics for artists or priests to follow, but the divine footprints of God guiding the way. The term strategy, heiho, is of Chinese origin and refers to military strategy. Hei means soldier and ho means method or form. 3 Homage to heaven, 10 or heaven means the Shinto religion, Shinto, a word compounding the 2 characters kami, God, and michi, wei is the old religion of Japan. In Shinto there are many holies, gods of steel and fermentation, place and industry, and so on, and the first gods, ancestors to the imperial line. Kwannon, God, des, of mercy in Buddhism. Arima Kihei, of the Shinto school. See Note 15. All things with no teacher, there had been traditions instituted for the arts in the Muromachi period, system of grades and licenses and seniority, and these were perpetuated perhaps more rigidly under the Tokugawa bureaucracy. Musashi studied various arts in various schools, but when after his enlightenment he pursued his studies he had become separate from traditional guidance. He writes his final words in the Book of the Void, "Then you will come to think of things in a wide sense, and taking the void as the way, you will see the way is void." Spirit Shin or Kokoro has been translated heart, soul, or spirit. It could be put as feeling, manner. It has always been said the sword is the soul of the samurai, as it is mirrored in the way of heaven and Kwannon. The time is the night of the 10th day of the 10th month, at the hour of the tiger *, 3 to 5 a.m. The hour of the Figer, years, months and hours were named after the ancient Chinese zodiacal time system. The ground book strategy is the craft of the warrior. Commanders must enact the craft, and troopers should know this way. There is no warrior in the world today who really understands the way of strategy. There are various ways. There is the way of salvation by the law of Buddha, the way of Confucius governing the way of learning, the way of healing as a doctor, as a poet teaching the way of waka, degree archery, and many arts and skills. Each man practices as he feels inclined. It is said the warrior's is the twofold way of pen and sword, and he should have a taste for both ways. Even if a man has no natural ability, he can be a warrior by sticking assiduously to both divisions of the way. Generally speaking, the way of the warrior is resolute acceptance of death. Although not only warriors but priests, women, peasants. Waka, the 31-syllable poem. The word means Song of Japan or Song in Harmony. Tea drinking is studied in schools, just like sword fencing. It is basically a ritual, based on simple refined rules, between a few persons in a small room. Archery, the bow was the main weapon of the samurai of the Nara and Heian periods, and was later superseded by the sword. Archery is practiced as a ritual like tea and sword. Hachiman, the god of war, is often depicted as an archer, and the bow is frequently illustrated as part of the paraphernalia of the gods. Pen and sword, bunbu ichi or pen and sword in accord, is often presented in brushed calligraphy. Young men during the Tokugawa period were educated solely in writing the Chinese classics and exercising in swordplay. Pen and sword, in fact, filled the life of the Japanese nobility. Resolute acceptance of death. This idea can be summed up as the philosophy expounded in Hagakure or Hidden Leaves, a book written in the 17th century by Yamamoto Tsunenori and a few other samurai of the province Nabashima Han, present-day Saga. Under the Tokugawas, the enforced logic of the Confucius-influenced system ensured stability among the samurai, but it also meant the passing of certain aspects of Bushido. Discipline for both samurai and commoners became lax. Yamamoto Tsunenori had been counselor to Mitsushige, lord of Nabashima Han, for many years, and upon his lord's death he wanted to commit suicide with his family in a traditional manner. This kind of suicide was strictly prohibited by the new legislation, and, full of remorse, Yamamoto retired in sadness to the boundary of Nabashima Han. Here he met others who had faced the same predicament, and together they wrote a lament of what they saw as the decadence of Bushido. Their criticism is a revealing comment on the changing face of Japan during Musashi's lifetime. There is no way to describe what a warrior should do other than he should adhere to the way of the warrior, Bushido. I find that all men are negligent of this. There are a few men who can quickly reply to the question, what is the way of the warrior? This is because they do not know in their hearts. From this we can say they do not follow the way of the warrior. By the way of the warrior is meant death. The way of the warrior is death. This means choosing death whenever there is a choice between life and death. It means nothing more than this. It means to see things through, being resolved. Sayings like to die with your intention unrealized is to die uselessly, and so on, are from the weak Kyoto, Osaka Bushido. They are unresolved as to whether to keep to their original plan when faced with the choice of life and death. Every man wants to live. They theorize with staying alive in mind. The man who lives on when he had failed in his intention is a coward is a heartless definition. That to die having failed is to die uselessly is a mad point of view. This is not a shameful thing. It is the most important thing in the way of the warrior. If you keep your spirit correct from morning to night, accustomed to the idea of death and resolved on death, and consider yourself as a dead body, thus becoming one with the way of the warrior, you can pass through life with no possibility of failure. And lowlier folk have been known to die readily in the cause of duty or out of shame. This is a different thing. The warrior is different because studying the way of strategy is based on overcoming opponents. By achieving victory in individual sword fights or battles against large numbers, we can gain power and fame for ourselves or our lord. This is the virtue of strategy. In China and Japan, practitioners of the way have been known as masters of strategy. Warriors must learn this way. Recently, there have been people who have become successful strategists, but they are usually just sword fighters. The attendants of the Kashima Kantorai shrines in the province of Hitachi received instruction from the gods and created schools based on this teaching. They traveled from country to country, instructing men. This is the modern meaning of strategy. In ancient times, strategy was considered a beneficial practice and was listed among the 10 abilities and 7 arts. It was certainly an art, but its benefits were not limited to sword fighting. The true value of sword fighting cannot be seen solely through the techniques of sword fighting. If we look at the world, we see various arts being sold. People use equipment to sell themselves. It is as if the nut has become less important than the flower. In this kind of strategy, both the teachers and the learners are focused on showcasing and demonstrating their techniques, trying to quickly achieve success. They talk about this dojo and that dojo. They are looking for profit. Someone once said, "Immature strategy is the cause of grief." That was a true statement. Perform your duties properly. A servant must earnestly think about their employer's business. Such a person is an excellent retainer. In this house, there have been generations of outstanding gentlemen, and we are deeply impressed by their warm kindness, as well as the kindness of all our ancestors. They simply devoted themselves to their Lord, body and soul. Furthermore, our house excels in wisdom and technical skill. It would be a joyful thing if we could use these advantages to our benefit. Even an inflexible and useless person becomes a trusted retainer if they earnestly think about their Lord's welfare. To only think about the practical benefits of wisdom and technology is vulgar. Some people are prone to having sudden inspirations, while others arrive at solutions through careful consideration. However, if we investigate the heart of the matter, regardless of people's natural abilities, when their thinking rises above concern for their own welfare, wisdom that is independent of thought appears. Whoever deeply thinks about things, even if they carefully consider the future, will usually base their thoughts on their own welfare. As a result of such selfish thinking, they will only perform evil actions. It is very difficult for most foolish individuals to rise above thinking about their own welfare. Therefore, when you embark on something, before you start, set your intention on the 4 oaths and leave selfishness behind. Then you cannot fail. The 4 oaths are as follows: never be late in following the way of the warrior. Be useful to your Lord. Be respectful to your parents. Rise above love and grief and exist for the good of humanity. The term our Lord refers to the daimyo, who employed numerous samurai to fight for them. The Kashima Kantorai shrines were the original schools of kendo, which can be found in the traditions preserved in Shinto shrines. Many of the ancestors of these schools are buried in the Kanto area, not far from Tokyo, where the Kashima and Kantorai shrines still stand. Arimakie, the samurai whom Musashi killed at the age of 13, was a fencer of the Shinto school associated with these shrines. The Yagyu school was derived from the Kashima style. Shinto was a religion that emphasized industry in everyday life, and the war gods enshrined at Kashima and Kantorai are still invoked today as part of the everyday practice of the Shinto school. The term dojo means way place, the room where something is studied. There are 4 ways in which people pass through life, as gentlemen, farmers, artisans, and merchants. The way of the farmer involves using agricultural tools and observing the changes of the seasons. The way of the merchant is to obtain ingredients and use them to make a living. The way of the merchant is always focused on making a profit. The 3rd way is that of the gentleman warrior, who carries the weapons of their way. The way of the warrior is to master the virtue of their weapons. If a gentleman dislikes strategy, they will not appreciate the benefits of weaponry. Shouldn't they have a little taste for it? The 4th way is that of the artisan. The way of the carpenter involves becoming skilled in the use of tools, planning accurately, and executing the work accordingly. This is how they pass through life. These are the 4 ways of the gentleman, the farmer, the artisan, and the merchant. The comparison with carpentry is made because of the connection with houses. There are noble houses, warrior houses, ruined houses, thriving houses, the style of the house, the tradition of the house, and the name of the house. The carpenter uses a master plan for building, and the way of strategy is similar in that it requires a plan of campaign. If you want to learn the craft of war, ponder over this book. The teacher is like a needle, and the disciple is like thread. You must practice constantly. Like the foreman carpenter, the commander must know the natural rules, the rules of the country, and the rules of houses. This is the way of the foreman. The foreman carpenter must understand the architectural theory of towers and temples, and the plans of palaces, and must hire workers to construct houses. The way of the foreman carpenter is similar to the way of the commander of a warrior house. In the construction of houses, the choice of woods is important. Straight, not free timber of good appearance is used for the visible pillars, while straight timber with minor defects is used for the inner pillars. Timber that looks good, even if it is slightly weak, is used for the thresholds, lintels, doors, and sliding doors, and so on. Good, strong timber, even if it is gnarled and knotted, can always be used discreetly in construction. Timber that is weak or knotted throughout should be used as scaffolding, and later for firewood. The foreman carpenter assigns tasks to his workers based on their abilities. Some workers lay the floor, while others make sliding doors, thresholds, lintels, ceilings, and so on. Those with less skill lay the floor joists, and those with even less skill carve wedges and perform miscellaneous tasks. If the foreman knows and assigns tasks to his workers effectively, the finished work will be of good quality. The foreman should consider the abilities and limitations of his workers, interact with them, and not ask for anything unreasonable. He should understand their morale and spirit, and provide encouragement when necessary. This principle is similar to the concept of the 4 ways in Japanese society. The way of strategy is similar to that of a soldier. The carpenter sharpens his own tools and carries them in his toolbox, working under the guidance of his foreman. He uses an axe to make columns and girders, a plane to shape floorboards and shelves, and accurately cuts fine openwork and carvings, striving for an excellent finish based on his skill. This is the craft of carpenters. When the carpenter becomes skilled and understands measurements, he can become a foreman. The carpenter's achievement is to have well-cut tools and to create small shrines, writing shelves, tables, paper lanterns, chopping boards, and pot lids. These are the specialties of the carpenter. The same applies to the soldier. You should deeply contemplate this. The carpenter's achievement is to ensure that his work is not warped, that the joints are aligned, and that the work is truly plain so that it fits well and is not merely finished in sections. This is crucial. If you want to learn this way, carefully consider the teachings in this book one by one. You must conduct sufficient research. Outline of the 5 books of this book of strategy. The way is presented in 5 books, each focusing on different aspects. These are ground, water, fire, tradition, wind, and void. The main teachings of the way of strategy, from the perspective of my Ichi school, are explained in the ground book. It is challenging to fully grasp the true way solely through sword fencing. You must understand both the smallest and the largest things, the shallowest and the deepest things. Like a straight road mapped out on the ground, the first book is called the ground book. The second book is the water book. With water as the foundation, the spirit becomes like water. Water takes the shape of its container, sometimes flowing gently and other times becoming a wild sea. Water has a clear blue color. This book reveals the clarity of the teachings of the Ichi school. If you master the principles of sword fencing, when you can defeat one opponent with ease, you can defeat anyone in the world. The spirit of defeating one person is the same as defeating 10 million people. The strategist turns small things into big things, just as one can build a great Buddha from a 1-foot model. I cannot explain in detail how this is done. The principle of strategy is to have one thing and know 10,000 things. The teachings of the Ichi school are written in this water book. The third book is the fire book, which focuses on combat. The spirit of fire is fierce, whether the fire is small or large, just as battles can be. The way of battles is the same for one-on-one fights and for battles with 10,000 participants. You must understand that the spirit can be both big and small. What is large is easy to perceive, what is small is difficult to perceive. In other words, it is difficult for large groups of people to change their position, so their movements can be easily predicted. An individual can easily change their mind, so their movements are difficult to predict. It is important to understand this. The main message of this book is that one must train day and night in order to make quick decisions. In strategy, training must be treated as a normal part of life, with an unwavering spirit. The fire book describes combat and battle. The Wind book, on the other hand, is not about my Ichi school, but about other schools of strategy. By Wind, I mean old traditions, present-day traditions, and family traditions of strategy. In this way, I clearly explain the strategies of the world. This is tradition. It is difficult to know yourself if you do not know others. In all paths, there are distractions. If you study a path daily and your spirit deviates, you may think you are following a good path, but objectively it is not the true path. If you are following the true path and deviate even slightly, this will later become a significant deviation. You must realize this. Other strategies have come to be seen as mere sword fighting, and it is not unreasonable for this to be the case. The benefit of my strategy, although it includes sword fighting, lies in a separate principle. I have explained what is commonly meant by strategy in other schools in the tradition, Wind book. The Void book, the fifth book, is about the void. By void, I mean that which has no beginning and no end. Attaining this principle means not attaining the principle. The way of strategy is the way of nature. When you appreciate the power of nature and understand the rhythm of any situation, you will be able to naturally strike the enemy. All of this is the way of the void. I intend to show how to follow the true way according to nature in the Void book. The name Ichi Ryu and Itu, one school two swords, warriors, both commanders and soldiers, carry two swords at their belt. In the past, these were called the long sword and the sword, nowadays they are known as the sword and the companion sword. Let it be enough to say that in our land, for whatever reason, a warrior carries two swords at their belt. It is the way of the warrior. Nito Ichi Ryu demonstrates the advantage of using both swords. The spear and halberd are weapons that are carried outside. Students of the Ichi school way of strategy should train from the beginning with the sword and long sword in either hand. This is the truth. When you sacrifice your life, you must make full use of your weaponry. It is false not to do so, and to die with a weapon still sheathed. Two swords. The samurai wore two swords thrust through the belt with the cutting edges upward on the left side. The shorter, or companion, sword was carried at all times, and the longer sword worn only outside. From time to time, there were rules governing the style and length of swords. Samurai carried two swords, but other classes were allowed only one sword for protection against bandits on the roads between towns. See translator's introduction. The samurai kept their swords by their bedsides, and there were racks for long swords inside the entrance of every samurai home. Spear and halberd. The techniques for spear and halberd fighting are the same as those of sword fighting. Spears were first popular in the Muromachi period, primarily as weapons for the vast armies of common infantry, and later became objects of decoration for the processions of the daimyo to and from the capital in the Tokugawa period. The spear is used for cutting and thrusting, and is not thrown. The halberd and similar weapons with long curved blades were especially effective against cavalry and came to be used by women who might have to defend their homes in the absence of menfolk. The art is widely studied by women today. If you hold a sword with both hands, it is difficult to wield it freely to the left and right, so my method is to carry the sword in one hand. This does not apply to large weapons such as the spear or halberd, but swords and companion swords can be carried in one hand. It is burdensome to hold a sword in both hands when you are on horseback, running on uneven roads, on swampy ground, muddy rice fields, stony ground, or in a crowd of people. Holding the long sword in both hands is not the true way, for if you carry a bow or spear or other weapons in your left hand, you have only one hand free for the long sword. However, when it is difficult to strike down an enemy with one hand, you must use both hands. It is not difficult to wield a sword in one hand. The way to learn this is to train with two long swords, one in each hand. It will seem difficult at first, but everything is difficult at first. Bows are difficult to draw, halberds are difficult to wield. As you become accustomed to the bow, your pull will become stronger. When you become used to wielding the long sword, you will gain the power of the way and wield the sword well. As I will explain in the second book, the Water Book, there is no quick way of wielding the long sword. The long sword should be wielded broadly, and the companion sword closely. This is the first thing to realize. According to the Ichi school, you can win with a long weapon, and yet you can also win with a short weapon. In short, the way of the Ichi school is the spirit of winning, regardless of the weapon and its size. It is more effective to use 2 swords instead of 1 when fighting a crowd, especially if the goal is to capture a prisoner. These details cannot be explained fully. From one thing, understand 10,000 things. When you achieve the way of strategy, there will be nothing you cannot perceive. You must study diligently. The advantage of reading the characters for strategy. Those who excel in the use of the long sword are called strategists. As for other military arts, those who excel in archery are called archers, those who excel in spearfighting are called spearmen, those who excel in gunmanship are called marksmen, and those who excel in wielding the halberd are called halberdiers. However, we do not refer to masters of the way of the long sword as longswordsmen, nor do we speak of companion swordsmen. Bows, guns, spears, and halberds are all tools of warfare and are certainly part of strategy. Mastering the virtue of the long sword means governing oneself and the world, making the long sword the foundation of strategy. The principle is strategy through the long sword. If one attains the virtue of the long sword, one person can defeat 10. Just as one person can defeat 10, 100 can defeat 1,000, and 1,000 can defeat 10,000. In my strategy, one person is equivalent to 10,000, making this strategy the complete craft of a warrior. The way of the warrior does not encompass other ways such as Confucianism, Buddhism, certain traditions, artistic accomplishments, and dancing. However, even though these are not part of the way, if you have a broad understanding of the way, you will see it in everything. Men must refine their own particular way. The Japanese gun was a matchlock, the type introduced to the country by missionaries. The matchlock remained in use until the 19th century. Dancing. There are various types of dancing. Festival dances, such as the harvest dance, incorporate local characteristics and are vibrant, often involving many people. No theater is performed by a few actors using stylized dance movements. There are also dances with fans and dances with swords. The benefit of weapons and strategy. There is a time and place for the use of weapons. The companion sword is most effective in confined spaces or when engaged in close combat with an opponent. The long sword can be used effectively in all situations. The halberd is inferior to the spear on the battlefield. With a spear, one can take the initiative, while the halberd is defensive. In the hands of 2 equally skilled individuals, the spear provides a slight advantage. Both the spear and halberd have their uses, but they are not very useful in confined spaces and cannot be used to capture a prisoner. They are primarily weapons for open fields. However, if you focus solely on indoor techniques, you will have a narrow perspective and forget the true way, making it difficult to succeed in actual encounters. The bow is tactically strong at the beginning of a battle, especially in battles on open terrain, as it allows for quick shooting from among the spearmen. However, it is ineffective in sieges or when the enemy is more than 40 yards away. For this reason, traditional schools of archery are scarce nowadays. This skill has little practical use in modern times. From within fortifications, the gun is unparalleled as a weapon. It is the supreme weapon on the field before close combat begins, but once swords are crossed, the gun becomes useless. One advantage of the bow is that you can see the arrows in flight and adjust your aim accordingly, whereas gunshots cannot be seen. It is important to recognize the significance of this. Just as a horse must be enduring and free of defects, so it is with weapons. Horses should have strong gaits, and swords and companion swords should have sharp cutting edges. Spears and halberds must withstand heavy use, while bows and guns must be sturdy. Weapons should prioritize durability over decoration. You should not have a favorite weapon. Becoming too familiar with one weapon is as much a flaw as not knowing it well enough. You should not imitate others but use weapons that you can handle proficiently. Commanders and troops having preferences is detrimental. These are things you must thoroughly learn. Timing and strategy. Timing is crucial in everything. Mastery of timing and strategy requires extensive practice. Timing is important in dancing, pipe or string music, as rhythm is achieved only with good timing. Timing and rhythm are also essential in the military arts, such as shooting bows and guns and riding horses. All skills and abilities involve timing. Timing is also present in the void. Timing encompasses the entire life of a warrior, including their growth and decline, harmony and discord. Similarly, timing is present in the way of the merchant, in the rise and fall of capital. All things involve rising and falling timing. You must be able to discern this. In strategy, there are various considerations of timing. From the beginning, you must understand the appropriate timing and the inappropriate timing, and among the numerous factors and the fast and slow timings, identify the relevant timing by first observing the distance timing and the background timing. This is the essence of strategy. Understanding the background timing is particularly important, as it ensures that your strategy remains certain. You achieve victory in battles by utilizing the timing in the void, born from the timing of cunning, by knowing the enemy's timing and using a timing that the enemy does not expect. All 5 books primarily focus on timing. You must train extensively to fully grasp all of this. If you practice day and night in the above Ichi school strategy, your spirit will naturally expand. This is the essence of large-scale strategy and hand-to-hand combat that is spread throughout the world. These teachings are first recorded in the 5 books of ground, water, fire, tradition, wind, and void. This is the path for those who wish to learn my strategy. Do not think dishonestly. The path lies in training. Familiarize yourself with every art. Understand the ways of all professions. Differentiate between gain and loss in worldly matters. Develop intuitive judgment and understanding for everything. Perceive things that cannot be seen. Pay attention even to trivial matters. Do nothing that is of no use. It is important to internalize these broad principles and train in the way of strategy. If you do not have a broad perspective, it will be difficult for you to master strategy. By learning and attaining this strategy, you will never lose even to 20 or 30 enemies. Above all, you must set your heart on strategy and earnestly adhere to the way. You will become capable of defeating opponents in combat and winning with your perception. Through training, you will gain control over your own body, overcome opponents with your physicality, and with sufficient training, defeat 10 men with your spirit. When you reach this point, will it not mean that you are invincible? Furthermore, in large-scale strategy, a superior individual will skillfully manage many subordinates, conduct themselves properly, govern the country, and nurture the people, thereby upholding the ruler's discipline. If there is a path that involves the spirit of not being defeated, to help oneself and gain honor, it is the path of strategy. The 2nd year of Shoho, 1645, the 5th month, the 12th day. Teruo Maganojo Shinman Musashi. Teruo Maganojo, the pupil, sometimes called Teruo Nobuyuki, to whom Musashi addressed Go-Rin no Sho. The Water Book. The essence of the Nai-Ten Ichi school of strategy is based on water, and this water book explains methods of victory using the longsword techniques of the Ichi school. Language cannot fully explain the way in detail, but it can be understood intuitively. Study this book, read a word and contemplate its meaning. If you interpret the meaning loosely, you will misunderstand the way. The principles of strategy are written here in terms of single combat, but you must think broadly to understand them in the context of battles involving 10,000 soldiers. Strategy is different from other disciplines in that even a slight deviation from the way can lead to confusion and bad outcomes. Merely reading this book will not bring you to the way of strategy. Absorb the teachings written here. Do not just read, memorize, or imitate, but study diligently to internalize these principles within your own being. Spiritual bearing in strategy. In strategy, your demeanor should not differ from your normal state. Whether in combat or in everyday life, you should be resolute yet calm. Approach situations without tension, but not recklessly. Keep your spirit settled and unbiased. Even when your spirit is calm, do not let your body relax, and when your body is relaxed, do not let your spirit slacken. Do not let your spirit be influenced by your body, or your body be influenced by your spirit. Do not be excessively spirited or lacking in spirit. An overly elevated spirit is weak, and a low spirit is weak as well. Do not let the enemy perceive your spirit. Those of lesser stature must fully understand the spirit of those who are greater, and those who are greater must understand the spirit of those who are lesser. Regardless of your size, do not be swayed by the reactions of your own body. With an open and unobstructed spirit, view things from a higher perspective. Cultivate your wisdom and spirit. Sharpen your wisdom, learn about justice, distinguish between good and evil, and study various arts one by one. When you cannot be deceived by others, you will have attained the wisdom of strategy. The wisdom of strategy is distinct from other forms of knowledge. Even when you are under pressure on the battlefield, continuously explore the principles of strategy so that you can maintain a steady spirit. Stance and strategy. Adopt a stance with your head held high, neither hanging down nor looking up, nor twisted. Your forehead and the space between your eyes should be relaxed, without wrinkles. Do not roll your eyes or blink excessively, but slightly narrow them. Keep your features composed, with a straight line from your nose to your forehead, slightly flaring your nostrils. Keep the back of your neck straight, infusing energy into your hairline, and extend this energy from your shoulders down through your entire body. Lower both shoulders and, without protruding your buttocks, exert strength in your legs from your knees to the tips of your toes. Brace your abdomen to avoid bending at the hips. Wedge your companion's sword in your belt against your abdomen, ensuring that your belt is not loose. This is called wedging in. In all forms of strategy, it is necessary to maintain the combat stance in everyday life and make your everyday stance your combat stance. Study this well. The gaze in strategy. Your gaze should be wide and expansive. This is the dual gaze of perception and sight. Perception is strong, while sight is weak. In strategy, it is important to see distant things as if they were close and to take a distant view of close things. It is crucial to understand the enemy's sword and not be distracted by insignificant movements of their sword. You must study this. The gaze is the same for single combat and for large-scale combat. It is necessary in strategy to be able to look to both sides without moving the eyeballs. You cannot master this ability quickly. Learn what is written here, use this gaze in everyday life and do not vary it whatever happens. Holding the long sword. Grip the long sword with a rather loose feeling in your thumb and forefinger, with the middle finger neither tight nor slack, and with the last two fingers tight. It is bad to have play in your hands. When you take up a sword, you must feel intent on cutting the enemy. As you cut an enemy, you must not change your grip, and your hands must not cower. When you deflect the enemy's sword aside, or parry it, or force it down, you must slightly change the feeling in your thumb and forefinger. Above all, you must be intent on cutting the enemy in the way you grip the sword. The grip for combat and for sword testing is the same. There is no such thing as a man-cutting grip. Generally, I dislike rigidity in both long swords and hands. Rigidity means a dead hand. Flexibility is a living hand. You must bear this in mind. Footwork. With the tips of your toes somewhat lifted, tread firmly with your heels. Whether you move fast or slow, with large or small steps, your feet must always move as in normal walking. I dislike the three walking methods known as jumping foot, floating foot, and fixed steps. So-called yin-yang foot is important to the way. Yin-yang foot means not moving only one foot. It means moving your feet left-right and right-left when cutting, withdrawing, or parrying a cut. You should not move one foot preferentially. The 5 attitudes. The 5 attitudes are upper, middle, lower, right side, and left side. These are the 5. Although attitude has these 5 dimensions, the one purpose of all of them is to cut the enemy. There are none but these 5 attitudes. Whatever attitude you are in, do not be conscious of making the attitude, think only of cutting. Your attitude should be large or small according to the situation. Upper, lower, and middle attitudes are decisive. Left side and right side attitudes are fluid. Left and right attitudes should be used if there is an obstruction overhead or to one side. The decision to use left or right depends on the place. The essence of the way is this. To understand attitude, you must thoroughly understand the middle attitude. The middle attitude is the heart of the attitudes. If we look at strategy on a broad scale, the middle attitude is the seat of the commander, with the other four attitudes following the commander. You must appreciate this. The way of the long sword. Knowing the way of the long sword means we can wield with 2 fingers the sword that we usually carry. If we know the path of the sword well, we can wield it easily. If you try to wield the long sword quickly, you will mistake the way. To wield the long sword well, you must wield it calmly. If you try to wield it quickly, like a folding fan or a short sword, you will err by using short sword chopping. You cannot cut a man with a long sword using this method. When you have cut downwards with the long sword, lift it straight upwards. When you cut sideways, return the sword along a sideways path. Return the sword in a reasonable way, always stretching the elbows broadly. Wield the sword strongly. This is the way of the long sword. If you learn to use the 5 approaches of my strategy, you will be able to wield a sword well. You must train constantly. The 5 approaches. The first approach is the middle attitude. Confront the enemy with the point of your sword against his face. When he attacks, deflect his sword to the right and right it. Or, when the enemy attacks, deflect the point of his sword by hitting downwards, keep your long sword where it is, and as the enemy renews the attack, cut his arms from below. This is the first method. The 5 approaches are this kind of thing. You must train repeatedly using a long sword in order to learn them. When you master my way of the long sword, you will be able to control any attack the enemy makes. I assure you, there are no stances other than the 5 stances of the long sword of Nito. In the second approach with the long sword, from the upper stance, cut the enemy as he attacks. If the enemy avoids the cut, keep your sword in place and, scooping from below, cut him as he renews the attack. It is possible to repeat the cut from here. This method involves various changes in timing and spirit. You will understand this by training in the Ichi school. You will always win with the 5 longsword methods. You must train repeatedly. In the third approach, adopt the lower stance, anticipating scooping up. When the enemy attacks, hit his hands from below. As you do so, he may try to hit your sword down. If this happens, cut his upper arms horizontally with a feeling of crossing. This means that from the lower stances, you hit the enemy at the moment he attacks. You will encounter this method often, both as a beginner and in later strategy. You must train while holding a long sword. In this fourth approach, adopt the left side stance. As the enemy attacks, hit his hands from below. If as you hit his hands he attempts to push down your sword, with the feeling of hitting his hands, parry the path of his long sword and cut across from above your shoulder. This is the way of the long sword. Through this method, you win by parrying the line of the enemy's attack. You must study this. In the fifth approach, the sword is in the right side stance. In accordance with the enemy's attack, cross your sword from below at the side to the upper stance. Then cut straight from above. This method is essential for knowing the way of the long sword well. If you can use this method, you can freely wield a heavy long sword. I cannot describe in detail how to use these 5 approaches. You must become well acquainted with my in harmony with the long sword way, learn large-scale timing, understand the enemy's long sword, and become used to the 5 approaches from the outset. You will always win by using these 5 methods, with various timing considerations discerning the enemy's spirit. You must consider all this carefully. The attitude no attitude teaching. Attitude no attitude means that there is no need for what are known as longsword stances. Even so, stances exist as the 5 ways of holding the long sword. However you hold the sword, it must be in such a way that it is easy to cut the enemy well, in accordance with the situation, the place, and your relation to the enemy. From the upper stance, as your spirit lessens, you can adopt the middle stance, and from the middle stance, you can raise the sword a little in your technique and adopt the upper stance. From the lower stance, you can raise the sword a little and adopt the middle stances as the occasion demands. According to the situation, if you turn your sword from either the left side or right side stance towards the center, the middle or the lower stance results. The principle of this is called existing attitude, non-existing attitude. The primary thing when you take a sword in your hands is your intention to cut the enemy, whatever the means. Whenever you parry, hit, spring, strike, or touch the enemy's cutting sword, you must cut the enemy in the same movement. It is essential to attain this. If you think only of hitting, springing, striking, or touching the enemy, you will not be able to actually cut him. More than anything, you must be thinking of carrying your movement through to cutting him. You must thoroughly research this. Attitude and strategy on a larger scale is called battle array. Such attitudes are all for winning battles. Fixed formation is bad. Study this well. To hit the enemy in one timing. In one timing means, when you have closed with the enemy, to hit him as quickly and directly as possible, without moving your body or settling your spirit, while you see that he is still undecided. The timing of hitting before the enemy decides to withdraw, break, or hit, is this in one timing. You must train to achieve this timing, to be able to hit in the timing of an instant. The abdomen timing of 2. When you attack and the enemy quickly retreats, as you see him tense, you must feign a cut. Then, as he relaxes, follow up and hit him. This is the abdomen timing of 2. It is very difficult to attain this merely by reading this book, but you will soon understand with a little instruction. No design, no conception. In this method, when the enemy attacks and you decide to attack, hit with your body, and hit with your spirit, and hit from the void with your hands, accelerating strongly. This is the no design, no conception cut. This is the most important method of hitting. It is often used. You must train hard to understand it. The flowing water cut. The flowing water cut is used when you are engaged in a blade-to-blade struggle with the enemy. When he breaks and quickly withdraws, trying to spring with his long sword, expand your body and spirit and cut him as slowly as possible with your long sword, following your body like stagnant water. You can cut with certainty if you learn this. You must discern the enemy's skill level. Continuous cut. When you attack and the enemy also attacks, and your swords clash together, in one action, cut his head, hands, and legs. When you cut multiple places with one swing of the long sword, it is called the continuous cut. It is important to practice this technique as it is frequently used. With detailed practice, you should be able to understand and execute it effectively. The fire and stones cut refers to cutting as strongly as possible when your long sword clashes with the enemy's sword, without raising your sword even slightly. This involves quick and strong cuts using your hands, body, and legs. By training well, you will be able to strike with great force. The red leaves cut involves knocking down the enemy's sword. The key is to gain control over the enemy's sword. When the enemy is in a position to cut, hit, or parry with their long sword, you can use the fire and stones cut to strike their swords strongly, possibly in the manner of the no design, no conception cut. By then beating down the point of their sword with a sticky feeling, they will inevitably drop their sword. Practicing this cut will make it easier for you to make the enemy drop their sword. Repetitive training is necessary. The body in place of the long sword or the long sword in place of the body refers to the technique of moving your body and sword simultaneously to attack the enemy. However, depending on the enemy's cutting method, you can first dash against them with your body and then follow up with a sword cut. If the enemy's body is immovable, you can cut first with the long sword. Generally, though, you hit first with your body and then cut with the long sword. It is important to thoroughly research and practice this technique of hitting. Cutting and slashing are two distinct actions. Cutting, regardless of the specific form, is decisive and requires a resolute spirit. Slashing, on the other hand, is merely touching the enemy. Even if you slash strongly and the enemy dies instantly, it is still considered slashing. When you cut, your spirit must be resolved. It is crucial to understand and appreciate this distinction. If you first slash the enemy's hands or legs, you must then follow up with a strong cut. Slashing is essentially the same as touching. Once you realize this, they become indistinguishable. Learn this well. The term Chinese monkey's body likely refers to the agility and quickness of a monkey. The spirit of this technique is to swiftly close in on the enemy without extending your arms, before they have a chance to cut. By avoiding arm extension, you effectively create distance, allowing you to go in with your entire body. When you come within arm's reach, it becomes easier to move your body. Thoroughly research and understand this technique. The spirit of glue and lacquer emulsion body is to stick to the enemy and not separate from them. When you approach the enemy, firmly stick with your head, body, and legs. People often advance their head and legs quickly, but their body lags behind. You should stick firmly so that there is no gap between your body and the enemy's body. Consider this carefully. To strive for height means to compete with the enemy for superior height without cowering when you engage with them. Stretch your legs, hips, and neck, facing the enemy directly. When you believe you have the advantage in height, thrust strongly. Learn this technique. When the enemy attacks and you counter with your long sword, go in with a sticky feeling and press your long sword against the enemy's sword as you receive their attack. The spirit of stickiness is not to strike forcefully, but to strike in a way that prevents the swords from easily separating. It is best to approach calmly when hitting the enemy's sword with stickiness. The difference between stickiness and entanglement is that stickiness is firm, while entanglement is weak. Understand and appreciate this distinction. The body strike involves approaching the enemy through a gap in their defense and striking them with your body. Turn your face slightly aside and strike the enemy's chest with your left shoulder thrust forward. Approach with the intention of pushing the enemy away, striking with maximum force in sync with your breathing. If you master this method of engaging with the enemy, you will be able to knock them back 10 or 20 feet. It is even possible to strike the enemy until they are dead. Train diligently. There are 3 methods to parry a cut. First, by deflecting the enemy's sword to your right, as if aiming for their eyes when they attack. Second, by thrusting the enemy's sword towards their right eye, as if snipping their neck. Third, when you have a short or long sword, you can quickly close in on the enemy and thrust at their face with your left hand, without worrying about parrying their sword. Remember that you can always clench your left hand and thrust at the enemy's face with your fist. It is necessary to train well for this. To stab at the face means that when you are facing the enemy, your focus is on stabbing at their face, following the line of their blade with the point of your long sword. If you aim to strike at his face and body will become vulnerable. When the enemy becomes vulnerable, there are various opportunities for victory. You must focus on this. When fighting and the enemy's body becomes vulnerable, you can win quickly, so you should not forget to strike at the face. You must pursue the value of this technique through training. To strike at the heart. To strike at the heart means that, when fighting and there are obstacles above or to the sides, and whenever it is difficult to cut, to thrust at the enemy. You must thrust at the enemy's chest without letting the point of your long sword waver, showing the enemy the edge of the blade head-on, and with the intention of deflecting his long sword. The intention of this principle is often useful when we become tired or for some reason our long sword will not cut. You must understand the application of this method. To scold. Tut. Scold means that, when the enemy tries to countercut as you attack, you countercut again from below as if thrusting at him, trying to hold him down. With very quick timing you cut, scolding the enemy. Thrust up, tut, and cut tut. This timing is encountered time and time again in exchanges of blows. The way to scold tut is to time the cut simultaneously with raising your long sword as if to thrust the enemy. You must learn this through repetitive practice. The smacking parry. By smacking parry is meant that when you clash swords with the enemy, you meet his attacking cut on your long sword with a T-dum rhythm, smacking his sword and cutting him. The intention of the smacking parry is not parrying, or smacking strongly, but smacking the enemy's long sword in accordance with his attacking cut, primarily intent on quickly cutting him. If you understand the timing of smacking, however hard your long swords clash together, your sword point will not be knocked back even a little. You must research sufficiently to realize this. There are many enemies. There are many enemies applies when you are fighting one against many. Draw both sword and companion sword and assume a wide-stretched left and right attitude. The intention is to chase the enemies around from side to side, even though they come from all four directions. Observe their attacking order, and go to meet first those who attack first. Sweep your eyes around broadly, carefully examining the attacking order, and cut left and right alternately with your swords. Waiting is bad. Always quickly reassume your attitudes to both sides, cut the enemies down as they advance, crushing them in the direction from which they attack. Whatever you do, you must drive the enemy together, as if tying a line of fishes, and when they are seen to be piled up, cut them down strongly without giving them room to move. The advantage when coming to blows. You can know how to win through strategy with the long sword, but it cannot be clearly explained in writing. You must practice diligently in order to understand how to win. Oral tradition, the true way of strategy is revealed in the long sword. One cut. You can win with certainty with the spirit of one cut. It is difficult to attain this if you do not learn strategy well. If you train well in this way, strategy will come from your heart and you will be able to win at will. You must train diligently. Direct communication. The spirit of direct communication is how the true way of the Nido-Ichi school is received and handed down. Oral tradition, teach your body strategy. Recorded in the above book is an outline of Ichi school sword fighting. To learn how to win with the long sword in strategy, first learn the 5 approaches and the 5 attitudes, and absorb the way of the long sword naturally in your body. You must understand spirit and timing, handle the long sword naturally, and move body and legs in harmony with your spirit. Whether facing one man or two, you will then know values in strategy. Study the contents of this book, taking one item at a time, and through fighting with enemies you will gradually come to know the principle of the way. There are many enemies. Musashi is held to be the inventor of the two-sword style. His school is sometimes called Nido-Ryu, two-sword school, and sometimes Nitten-Ryu, two-heavens school. He writes that the use of two swords is for when there are many enemies, but people practice a style of fencing with a sword in each hand to give practical advantage in fencing. Musashi used the words two swords when meaning to use all one's resources in combat. He never used two swords when up against a skilled swordsman. Oral tradition. Other kendo schools also have oral traditions as opposed to teachings passed on in formal technique. One cut. Whatever this means, it is worthwhile to note that Hatatsagachi, one victory, the Kiryotoshi technique of the Ido-Ryu school, where one cut provides attack and defense, cutting down the enemy's sword and spirit, and the related Ichi no Tachi, long sword of one, of the Shinto style. Deliberately, with a patient spirit, absorb the virtue of all this, from time to time raising your hand in combat. Maintain this spirit whenever you cross swords with an enemy. Step by step walk the 1,000-mile road. Study strategy over the years and achieve the spirit of the warrior. Today is victory over yourself of yesterday, tomorrow is your victory over lesser men. Next, in order to beat more skilled men, train according to this book, not allowing your heart to be swayed along a sidetrack. Even if you kill an enemy, if it is not based on what you have learned, it is not the true way. If you achieve this path to victory, then you will be able to defeat several tens of men. What remains is sword fighting ability, which you can acquire through battles and duels. The second year of Shoho, the 12th day of the 5th month, 1645, Teruo Maganojo Shinman Musashi. The fire book. In this fire book of the Nido-Ichi school of strategy, I describe fighting as fire. First and foremost, people have a narrow understanding of the benefits of strategy. They only use their fingertips and are aware of only 3 of the 5 inches of their wrist. They let a contest be decided, like with a folding fan, merely by the span of their forearms. They specialize in the small matter of dexterity, learning trivial movements of the hands and legs with the bamboo practice sword. In my strategy, the training for killing enemies is through numerous contests, fighting for survival, discovering the meaning of life and death, learning the way of the sword, judging the strength of attacks, and understanding the way of the edge and ridge of the sword. You cannot benefit from small techniques, especially when wearing full armor. My strategy is the sure method to win when fighting for your life against 5 or 10 men. There is nothing wrong with the principle one man can beat 10, so 1,000 men can beat 10,000. You must research this. Of course, you cannot gather 1,000 or 10,000 men for daily training. But you can become a master of strategy by training alone with a sword, so that you can understand the enemy's strategies, their strength and resources, and learn how to apply strategy to defeat 10,000 enemies. Anyone who wants to master the essence of my strategy must diligently research and train, morning and evening. Through this, they can refine their skills, free themselves from self, and realize extraordinary ability. They will possess miraculous power. This is the practical result of strategy. Depending on the place, examine your environment. Stand in the sun, that is, take up a position with the sun behind you. If the situation does not allow this, you must try to keep the sun on your right side. In buildings, you must stand with the entrance behind you or to your right. Make sure that your rear is unobstructed, and that there is free space on your left, with your sword held on your right side. At night, if the enemy can be seen, keep the fire behind you and the entrance to your right, and otherwise take up your position as mentioned above. You must look down on the enemy, and take up a position on slightly higher ground. For example, the bamboo practice sword. There have been practice swords of various kinds throughout the history of kendo. Some are made of spliced bamboo covered with cloth or hide. Full armor, the words rokugu, 6 pieces, are used. This is a set of armor consisting of cuirass, gauntlets, sleeves, apron and thigh pieces, or, according to another convention, body armor, helmet, mask, thigh pieces, gauntlets and leg pieces. Camisa ** in a house is thought of as a high place. When the fight comes, always strive to chase the enemy around to your left side. Chase them towards inconvenient places, and try to keep them with their back to inconvenient places. When the enemy gets into an unfavorable position, do not let them look around, but diligently chase them and pin them down. In houses, chase the enemy into thresholds, lintels, doors, verandas, pillars, and so on, again not letting them see their situation. Always chase the enemy into bad footholds, obstacles at the side, and so on, using the advantages of the place to establish dominant positions from which to fight. You must diligently research and train in this. The 3 methods to anticipate the enemy. The first is to anticipate them by attacking. This is called ken no sen, to set them up. Another method is to anticipate them as they attack. This is called tai no sen, to wait for the initiative. The other method is when you and the enemy attack together. This is called tai no sen, to accompany them and anticipate them. There are no methods of taking the lead other than these 3. Because you can win quickly by taking the lead, it is one of the most important things in strategy. There are several factors involved in taking the lead. You must make the best of the situation, understand the enemy's spirit so that you grasp their strategy and defeat them. It is impossible to write about this in detail. The first ken no sen: when you decide to attack, remain calm and dash in quickly, anticipating the enemy. Or you can advance seemingly strongly but with a reserve spirit, anticipating them with your reserve. Alternatively, advance with as strong a spirit as possible, and when you reach the enemy, move your feet a little quicker than normal, unsettling and overwhelming them sharply. Or, with a calm spirit, attack with a feeling of constantly crushing the enemy, from start to finish. The spirit is to win within the depths of the enemy. These are all ken no sen. The second tai no sen: when the enemy attacks, remain undisturbed but feign weakness. As the enemy approaches, suddenly move away as if you intend to dodge, then quickly dash in and attack strongly as soon as you see the enemy relax. This is one way. Kazima: this is the residence of the ancestral spirit of a house. The head of the house sits nearest this place. It is often a slightly raised recess in a wall, sometimes containing a hanging scroll, armor, or other religious property. The 3 methods to anticipate an enemy. A great swordsman or other artist will have mastered the ability to anticipate the enemy. The skilled swordsman is always attuned to his surroundings. This does not refer to speed alone. A proficient swordsman cannot be defeated because he subconsciously anticipates the origin of every genuine action. In kendo practice, one can observe elderly gentlemen calmly striking young champions on the head. It is their honed ability to instantly assess a changing situation. When the enemy attacks, they counter with even greater force, taking advantage of the resulting chaos in their opponent's timing to secure victory. This is known as the Tai-no-sen principle. The third Tai-no-sen is employed when the enemy launches a swift attack. In response, one must counter with a strong and composed attack, aiming for the enemy's weak point as they draw near, and decisively defeating them. On the other hand, if the enemy attacks calmly, one must carefully observe their movements and, with a fluid body, synchronize with their actions as they approach. Move swiftly and strike with force. This is Tai-no-sen. These concepts cannot be fully conveyed through words alone. It is necessary to delve into the research presented here. In these three methods of preempting the enemy, one must assess the situation. This does not mean always attacking first, rather, if the enemy attacks first, one can lead them astray. In strategy, true victory is achieved by preempting the enemy, so one must train diligently to attain this skill. To hold down a pillow signifies preventing the enemy from gaining an advantage. In strategic contests, it is detrimental to be manipulated by the enemy. One must always be capable of leading the enemy. Of course, the enemy will also attempt to do the same, but they cannot outmaneuver you if you do not allow them to gain an advantage. In strategy, one must halt the enemy's attempts to strike, deflect their thrusts, and break free from their holds when they attempt to grapple. This is the essence of to hold down a pillow. Once you grasp this principle, you will be able to anticipate and suppress any actions the enemy tries to execute during combat. The key is to intercept their attack at the syllable at, halt their advance at the syllable ju, and block their strike at cu. In strategy, it is crucial to suppress the enemy's effective actions while allowing their futile ones. However, solely adopting a defensive stance is insufficient. First, one must act in accordance with the way, neutralize the enemy's techniques, thwart their plans, and then directly command them. When one can accomplish this, they will become a master of strategy. It is imperative to train diligently and study the concept of holding down a pillow. Crossing at a ford refers to situations such as crossing a narrow strait or traversing 100 miles of open sea at a specific point. I believe such instances of crossing at a ford occur frequently in a person's lifetime. It entails setting sail even when friends choose to remain in harbor, possessing knowledge of the route, understanding the seaworthiness of one's vessel, and being aware of favorable conditions. When all the necessary conditions are met, and perhaps aided by a favorable or tailwind, one should embark on the journey. If the wind changes direction within a few miles of the destination, one must row the remaining distance without relying on sails. To hold down a pillow, note that samurai and Japanese ladies slept with heads on a small wooden pillow shaped to accommodate their hairstyle. If you embody this spirit, it will extend to your everyday life. Always consider the concept of crossing at a ford. In strategy, it is crucial to cross at a ford. Assess the enemy's capabilities, recognize your own strengths, and cross the ford at the most advantageous position, just as a skilled captain navigates a sea route. If you succeed in crossing at the optimal location, you can proceed with ease. Crossing at a ford means targeting the enemy's weak point and positioning oneself advantageously. This is the key to victory in both large-scale and small-scale strategy. It is essential to thoroughly study this concept. To know the times means understanding the enemy's disposition in battle. Is their strength growing or waning? By observing the spirit of the enemy's soldiers and securing the best position, one can discern the enemy's disposition and maneuver their own forces accordingly. Through this principle of strategy, one can achieve victory by fighting from a position of advantage. In a duel, one must preempt the enemy and strike when they have identified their opponent's school of strategy, discern their strengths and weaknesses. Attack in an unexpected manner, attuned to their rhythm and timing. Knowing the times means that, if one possesses great skill, they can perceive things deeply. If one is well versed in strategy, they will understand the enemy's intentions and have numerous opportunities to triumph. Sufficient study of this principle is necessary. To tread down the sword is a frequently employed principle in strategy. In large-scale strategy, when the enemy first unleashes arrows and gunfire before launching an attack, it becomes difficult for us to counter if we are occupied with loading powder into our guns or preparing our arrows. The spirit of this principle is to swiftly attack while the enemy is still engaged in shooting arrows or firing guns. The aim is to triumph by treading down the enemy as they launch their attack. In single combat, we cannot achieve a decisive victory by merely responding to the enemy's long sword with a rhythmic and predictable cutting motion. We must defeat them at the onset of their attack, in the spirit of treading them down with our feet, preventing them from rising to attack again. Treading here does not solely refer to using the feet. It encompasses using the entire body and spirit, and, of course, treading and cutting with the long sword. You must embody the spirit of preventing the enemy from launching a second attack. This is the essence of preempting in every sense. Once you engage the enemy, your goal should not be limited to striking them, but to pursue them relentlessly after the initial attack. You must deeply study this concept. Understanding collapse. Everything has the potential to collapse. Houses, bodies, and enemies collapse when their rhythm becomes disrupted. In large-scale strategy, when the enemy begins to collapse, you must relentlessly pursue them and not let the opportunity slip away. If you fail to take advantage of their collapse, they may recover. In single combat, the enemy may lose their timing and collapse. If you let this opportunity pass, they may recover and become more cautious. Keep your focus on the enemy's collapse and chase them, attacking in a way that prevents them from recovering. You must do this with a strong spirit. You must completely defeat the enemy so that they cannot regain their position. You must fully understand how to defeat the enemy. Becoming the enemy. To become the enemy means to put yourself in the enemy's position. In the world, people tend to view a robber trapped in a house as a fortified enemy. However, if we think of becoming the enemy, we feel that the whole world is against us and that there is no escape. The one who is trapped inside is a pheasant, while the one who enters to arrest is a hawk. You must understand this. In large-scale strategy, people often perceive the enemy as strong and become cautious. But if you have skilled soldiers, understand the principles of strategy, and know how to defeat the enemy, there is nothing to worry about. In single combat as well, you must put yourself in the enemy's position. If you think, here is a master of the way, who knows the principles of strategy, then you will surely lose. You must deeply consider this. Releasing four hands. To release four hands is used when you and the enemy are evenly matched, and the outcome cannot be determined. Abandon this approach and find an alternative way to win. In large-scale strategy, when there is a situation of equal strength, do not give up. It is essential for survival. Immediately discard this approach and win using a technique that the enemy does not expect. In single combat as well, when you find yourself in a situation of equal strength, you must defeat the enemy by changing your mindset and applying a suitable technique based on their condition. You must be able to judge this. Moving the shade. To move the shade is used when you cannot discern the enemy's intentions. In large-scale strategy, when you cannot determine the enemy's position, indicate that you are about to launch a strong attack to uncover their resources. Once you see their resources, it becomes easier to defeat them using a different method. In single combat, if the enemy adopts a defensive or evasive stance with their sword, making it difficult for you to discern their intentions, make a feint attack. The enemy will reveal their sword, thinking they have seen your spirit. Taking advantage of what you have been shown, you can win. Holding down a shadow. Holding down a shadow is used when you can perceive the enemy's aggressive spirit. In large-scale strategy, when the enemy initiates an attack, if you demonstrate a strong suppression of their technique, they will change their mind. Then, by altering your own spirit, defeat them by preempting their actions with a calm and empty mind. Similarly, in single combat, restrain the enemy's strong intention with well-timed actions, and defeat them by preempting their movements. You must study this thoroughly. Passing on. Many things can be passed on. Sleepiness can be passed on, yawning can be passed on, and even time can be passed on. In large-scale strategy, when the enemy is agitated and shows a tendency to rush, remain completely calm. Display complete composure, and the enemy will be influenced by this and become relaxed. Once you observe that this spirit has been passed on, you can bring about the enemy's defeat by launching a strong attack with an empty mind. In single combat, you can win by relaxing your body and mind, and then swiftly and forcefully attacking the moment the enemy relaxes, preempting their actions. This is similar to the concept of getting someone drunk. You can also infect the enemy with a bored, careless, or weak spirit. You must thoroughly study this. Causing loss of balance. Many factors can cause a loss of balance. Danger, hardship, and surprise are all potential causes. You must research this thoroughly. In large-scale strategy, it is crucial to disrupt the enemy's balance. Launch unexpected attacks where the enemy least expects it, and while their spirit is uncertain, capitalize on your advantage and defeat them. In single combat, start by appearing slow, then suddenly launch a strong attack. Without giving the enemy a chance to recover their composure, seize the opportunity to win. Familiarize yourself with this concept. Frightening fright often arises from the unexpected. In large-scale strategy, you can frighten the enemy not only through visual deception but also by shouting, making a small force appear larger, or by threatening them from an unexpected direction. These things all cause fear. You can win by taking advantage of the enemy's frightened state. In single combat, you must use the element of surprise to frighten the enemy with your body, sword, or voice in order to defeat them. It is important to thoroughly research this strategy. To engage closely. When you are in close combat with the enemy and realize that you cannot advance, you must engage closely and become one with the enemy. You can win by applying a suitable technique while you are entangled with each other. In battles with large or small numbers, you can often achieve a decisive victory by knowing how to engage closely with the enemy. If you were to draw apart, you would lose the opportunity to win. Research this strategy thoroughly. To attack the weak points. It is difficult to move strong things by pushing directly, so you should attack the weak points. In large-scale strategy, it is beneficial to strike at the corners of the enemy's force. If the corners are overthrown, the spirit of the whole body will be overthrown. To defeat the enemy, you must follow up the attack when the corners have fallen. In single combat, it is easy to win once the enemy collapses. This happens when you attack the weak points of their body, weakening them. It is important to know how to do this, so you must research it deeply. To confuse the enemy. This means making the enemy lose their resolve. In large-scale strategy, you can use your troops to confuse the enemy on the field. By observing the enemy's spirit, you can make them think, here, there, like that, like this, slow, fast. Victory is certain when the enemy is caught up in a rhythm that confuses their spirit. In single combat, you can confuse the enemy by attacking with varied techniques when the opportunity arises. Feign a thrust or cut, or make the enemy think you are approaching them closely, and when they are confused, you can easily win. This is the essence of fighting, and you must research it deeply. The three shouts. The three shouts are divided into three parts: before, during, and after. Shout according to the situation. The voice is a sign of life. We shout against fires, against the wind and the waves. The voice shows energy. In large-scale strategy, at the start of battle, we shout as loudly as possible. During the fight, the voice is low-pitched, shouting as we attack. After the contest, we shout in celebration of our victory. These are the three shouts. In single combat, we pretend to cut and shout "ei" at the same time to disturb the enemy. Then, after our shout, we cut with the long sword. We shout after we have defeated the enemy to announce victory. This is called Sengo no Ko, before and after voice. We do not shout simultaneously with flourishing the long sword. We shout during the fight to get into rhythm. Research this deeply. To mingle. In battles, when the armies are facing each other, attack the enemy's strong points. When you see that they are pushed back, quickly separate and attack another strong point on the periphery of their force. The spirit of this is like a winding mountain path. This is an important fighting method for one person against many. Strike down the enemies in one area, or drive them back, then seize the timing and attack other strong points to the right and left, as if on a winding mountain path, assessing the enemy's disposition. When you know the enemy's level, attack strongly without showing any signs of retreating. In single combat, use this spirit against the enemy's strong points. Mingling means advancing and engaging with the enemy, without withdrawing even one step. You must understand this. To overwhelm. This means to crush the enemy, considering them weak. In large-scale strategy, when we see that the enemy has few men, or if he has many men but his spirit is weak and disordered, we overpower him completely. If we crush lightly, he may recover. You must learn the spirit of crushing as if with a firm grip. In single combat, if the enemy is less skilled than yourself, if their rhythm is disorganized, or if they have fallen into evasive or retreating attitudes, we must crush them immediately, without concern for their presence and without allowing them space to breathe. It is essential to crush them all at once. The main thing is to not let them regain their position even a little. You must research this deeply. The Mountain Sea Change. The Mountain Sea spirit means that it is not effective to repeat the same approach several times when fighting the enemy. There may be no choice but to try something twice, but do not attempt it a third time. If you make an attack and fail once, there is little chance of success if you use the same approach again. If you attempt a technique that you have previously tried unsuccessfully and fail again, then you must change your attacking method. If the enemy expects the mountains, attack like the sea, and if they expect the sea, attack like the mountains. You must research this deeply. To penetrate the depths. When we are fighting with the enemy, even if it seems that we can win on the surface with the advantage of the way, if their spirit is not extinguished, they may be superficially beaten but undefeated in spirit deep inside. With the principle of penetrating the depths, we can destroy the enemy's spirit at its core, demoralizing them by quickly changing our own spirit. This often occurs. Penetrating the depths means penetrating with the long sword, penetrating with the body, and penetrating with the spirit. This cannot be understood in a general sense. Once we have defeated the enemy completely, there is no need to remain spirited. But in other cases, we must maintain our spirit. If the enemy remains spirited, it is difficult to defeat them. You must train in both large-scale strategy and single combat, learning to penetrate deeply. To renew applies when we are engaged in battle with the enemy and find ourselves in a stalemate with no possible resolution. We must abandon our efforts, approach the situation with a fresh perspective, and win using a new approach. To renew, when we are deadlocked with the enemy, means that without changing our circumstances, we change our mindset and achieve victory through a different technique. It is important to consider how to renew also applies in large-scale strategy. Research this diligently. Rat's head and ox's neck means that when we are fighting with the enemy and both sides become entangled in small details, we must always remember that the way of strategy is both about focusing on the small details and having a broad perspective. Whenever we become too fixated on small details, we must suddenly shift our mindset to a larger perspective. This is one of the key principles of strategy. It is necessary for warriors to think in this way in their everyday lives, both in large-scale strategy and single combat. The commander knows the troops applies to all fights in my way of strategy. By using strategic wisdom, we should think of the enemy as our own troops. When we think in this way, we can manipulate the enemy at will and chase them around. We become the general, and the enemy becomes our troops. Mastering this is crucial. There are various kinds of spirit involved in letting go the hilt. There is the spirit of winning without using a sword, as well as the spirit of holding the long sword but not winning. The various methods cannot be fully explained in writing. You must train diligently to understand them. When you have mastered the way of strategy, you can suddenly make your body like a rock, and nothing can touch you. This is the unmovable body of a rock. This is passed down through oral tradition. The information recorded above is what has constantly been on my mind about Ichi school sword fencing, written down as it came to me. This is the first time I have written about my technique, and the order of things may be a bit confused. It is difficult to express it clearly. This book serves as a spiritual guide for those who wish to learn the way. I have been inclined towards the way of strategy since my youth. I have dedicated myself to training my hand, tempering my body, and attaining the many spiritual attitudes of sword fencing. When observing practitioners of other schools discussing theory and focusing solely on techniques with their hands, although they may appear skilled, they lack true spirit. These individuals may believe they are training both their body and spirit, but it is an obstacle to the true way, and its negative influence remains forever. As a result, the true way of strategy is declining and fading away. The true way of sword fencing is the art of defeating the enemy in combat, and nothing else. If you attain and adhere to the wisdom of my strategy, you need never doubt that you will emerge victorious. In the Wind book, I discuss various other traditions of strategy to ensure that you understand the essence of my Ichi school. Without knowledge of other schools' approaches, it is difficult to grasp the core of my school. When examining other schools, we find some that specialize in techniques of strength using extra-long swords. Some schools focus on the way of the short sword, known as kodachi. Others emphasize dexterity in a multitude of sword techniques, considering the physical aspects of the sword as the surface and the way as the interior. I clearly demonstrate in this book that none of these are the true way, outlining their flaws and virtues. My Ichi school is different. Other schools make their accomplishments their livelihood, engaging in activities such as flower arrangement and decorative coloring to sell their products. This is definitely not the way of strategy. Some strategists in the world are solely concerned with sword fencing, limiting their training to flourishing the long sword and perfecting their physical form. But is dexterity alone enough to secure victory? This is not the essence of the way. I have meticulously recorded the shortcomings of other schools in this book. You must deeply study these matters to fully appreciate the benefits of my Anaita Ichi school. Some other schools have a preference for extra-long swords. From the perspective of my strategy, these schools must be considered weak. This is because they fail to appreciate the principle of defeating the enemy by any means necessary. They rely on the length of their swords and believe they can defeat the enemy from a distance. In this world, it is said, 1 inch gives the hand advantage, but these are the idle words of someone who does not understand strategy. It shows the inferior strategy of a weak spirit to rely on the length of one's sword, fighting from a distance without the benefit of strategy. Perhaps the school in question favors extra-long swords as part of its doctrine, but if we compare this to real life, it is unreasonable. Surely, we need not necessarily be defeated if we are using a short sword and do not have a long sword. It is difficult for these people to strike the enemy when in close quarters due to the length of the long sword. The path of the blade is large, making the long sword a hindrance, and they are at a disadvantage compared to someone armed with a short companion sword. From ancient times, it has been said, great and small go together. So, do not unconditionally dislike extra-long swords. What I dislike is the inclination towards the long sword. If we consider large-scale strategy, we can think of large forces in terms of long swords and small forces as short swords. Cannot a few men give battle against many? There are many instances of a few men overcoming many. Your strategy is of no value if, when called upon to fight in a confined space, your heart is inclined to the long sword or if you are in a house armed only with your companion sword. Besides, some men do not have the strength of others. In my doctrine, I dislike preconceived, narrow spirit. You must study this well. The strong long sword spirit in other schools. You should not speak of strong and weak long swords. If you just wield the long sword with a strong spirit, your cutting will become rough, and if you use the sword roughly, you will have difficulty in winning. If you are concerned with the strength of your sword, you will try to cut unreasonably forcefully and will not be able to cut at all. It is also bad to try to cut forcefully when testing the sword. Whenever you engage in combat with an enemy, you must not think of cutting him either strongly or weakly, just think of cutting and killing him. Be solely intent on killing the enemy. Do not try to cut forcefully and, of course, do not think of cutting weakly. You should only be concerned with killing the enemy. If you rely on strength, when you strike the enemy's sword, you will inevitably strike too hard. If you do this, your own sword will be carried along as a result. Thus, the saying, "the strongest hand wins," has no meaning. In large-scale strategy, if you have a strong army and are relying on strength to win, but the enemy also has a strong army, the battle will be fierce. This is the same for both sides. Without the correct principle, the fight cannot be won. The spirit of my school is to win through the wisdom of strategy, paying no attention to trivial matters. Study this well. Use of the short or long sword in other schools. Using a short or long sword is not the true way to win. In ancient times, tachi and katana meant long and short swords. Men of superior strength in the world can wield even a long sword lightly, so there is no reason for them to prefer the short sword. They also make use of the length of spears and halberds. Some men use a short or long sword with the intention of jumping in and stabbing the enemy at the unguarded moment when he flourishes his sword. This inclination is bad. To aim for the enemy's unguarded moment is completely defensive and undesirable in close quarters with the enemy. Furthermore, you cannot use the method of jumping inside his defense with a short sword if there are many enemies. Some men think that if they go against many enemies with a short or long sword, they can freely move around cutting in sweeps, but they have to continuously parry cuts and eventually become entangled with the enemy. This is inconsistent with the true way of strategy. The sure way to win is to chase the enemy around in a confusing manner, causing him to jump aside, with your body held strongly and straight. The same principle applies to large-scale strategy. The essence of strategy is to fall upon the enemy in large numbers and bring about his speedy downfall. By studying strategy, people in the world become accustomed to countering, evading, and retreating as the norm. They become set in this habit and can easily be manipulated by the enemy. The way of strategy is straightforward and true. You must chase the enemy around and make him obey your spirit. Other schools with many methods of using the long sword. I believe it is held in other schools that there are many methods of using the long sword in order to impress beginners. This is selling the way. It is a vile spirit in strategy. The reason for this is that deliberating over many ways of cutting down a man is an error. To begin with, killing is not the way of mankind. Killing is the same for people who know about fighting and for those who do not. It is the same for women or children, and there are not many different methods. We can speak of different tactics such as stabbing and slashing, but none other than these. Anyway, cutting down the enemy is the way of strategy, and there is no need for many refinements of it. Even so, depending on the situation, your long sword may be obstructed from above or to the sides, so you will need to hold your sword in a manner that allows it to be used. There are 5 methods in 5 directions. Methods other than the 5 mentioned, hand twisting, body bending, jumping out, and so on to attack the enemy, are not the true way of strategy. To successfully attack the enemy, one must not make twisting or bending cuts, as they are completely useless. In my strategy, I keep my spirit and body straight, causing the enemy to twist and bend. The key is to attack the enemy when their spirit is weakened. This must be studied well. Placing too much importance on the attitudes of the long sword is a mistaken way of thinking. The concept of attitude applies when there is no enemy. This has been a precedent since ancient times, as there should be no such thing as this is the modern way to do it in dueling. The goal is to force the enemy into inconvenient situations. Attitudes are for situations where one should not be moved, such as garrisoning castles or forming battle arrays, showing the spirit of not being moved even by a strong assault. However, in dueling, one must always be focused on taking the lead and attacking. Attitude is the spirit of awaiting an attack, and this must be understood. In duels of strategy, one must manipulate the opponent's attitude. Attack where their spirit is lax, throw them into confusion, irritate and terrify them. Take advantage of the enemy's rhythm when they are unsettled, and victory can be achieved. I dislike the defensive spirit known as attitude. Therefore, in my way, there is something called attitude no attitude. In large-scale strategy, we deploy our troops for battle considering our strength, observing the enemy's numbers, and noting the details of the battlefield. This is done at the start of the battle. The spirit of attacking is completely different from the spirit of being attacked. With a strong attitude, one must bear an attack well and parry the enemy's attack effectively, like making a wall of spears and halberds. When attacking the enemy, one's spirit must go to the extent of pulling the stakes out of a wall and using them as spears and halberds. This must be thoroughly examined. Some schools advocate fixing the eyes on the enemy's long sword, hands, face, feet, and so on. However, fixing the eyes on these places can confuse one's spirit and hinder their strategy. Football players do not fix their eyes on the ball, yet they can perform well on the field. When one becomes accustomed to something, they are not limited to the use of their eyes. Master musicians, for example, have the music score in front of them or flourish the sword in various ways when they have mastered their craft. However, this does not mean that they fix their eyes on these specific things or make pointless movements. It means that they can see naturally. In the way of strategy, after fighting many times, one will easily be able to assess the speed and position of the enemy's sword and perceive the weight of their spirit. Fixing the eyes means gazing at the enemy's heart and strategy. In large-scale strategy, one must observe the enemy's strength. There are various methods of using the feet, such as floating foot, jumping foot, springing foot, treading foot, crow's foot, and other nimble walking methods. From my perspective, all of these are unsatisfactory. I dislike floating foot because the feet tend to float during a fight. The way must be trod firmly. Jumping foot encourages the habit of jumping and a jumpy spirit, which is not justified. Springing foot leads to an indecisive spirit. Treading foot is a passive method that I particularly dislike. Additionally, there are various fast walking methods, like crow's foot, but in certain situations, such as marshland, swampy ground, river valleys, stony ground, or narrow roads, one cannot jump or move the feet quickly. In my strategy, footwork remains consistent. I always walk as I usually do on the street. Control of the feet must never be lost. Adjust the speed of movement according to the enemy's rhythm, without overdoing it or being too cautious. Carrying the feet is also important in large-scale strategy. This is because attacking quickly and thoughtlessly without understanding the enemy's spirit will disrupt one's rhythm and hinder victory. On the other hand, advancing too slowly will prevent taking advantage of the enemy's disorder, allowing the opportunity for victory to slip away and prolonging the fight. Victory must be achieved by seizing upon the enemy's disorder and derangement, leaving them no hope of recovery. Practice this well. Speed in other schools. Speed is not a part of the true way of strategy. Speed implies that things appear fast or slow, depending on whether or not they are in rhythm. Regardless of the way, a master of strategy does not appear fast. Some people can walk as fast as 100 or 120 miles in a day, but this does not mean that they run continuously from morning till night. Inexperienced runners may seem to have been running all day, but their performance is poor. In the way of dance, skilled performers can sing while dancing, but when beginners try this, they slow down and their spirit becomes preoccupied. The melody of the old pine tree played on a leather drum is tranquil, but when beginners try this, they slow down and their spirit becomes preoccupied. Very skilled individuals can manage a fast rhythm, but it is bad to beat hurriedly. If you try to beat too quickly, you will lose the rhythm. Of course, slowness is also bad. Truly skilled individuals never lose the rhythm, and are always deliberate, and never appear preoccupied. From this example, the principle can be seen. What is known as speed is especially bad in the way of strategy. The reason for this is that depending on the terrain, such as a marsh or swamp, it may not be possible to move the body and legs quickly together. Even less so will you be able to cut quickly if you have a long sword in this situation. If you try to cut quickly, as if using a fan or short sword, you will not actually cut even a little. You must understand this. In large-scale strategy as well, a fast and preoccupied spirit is undesirable. The spirit must be that of holding down a pillow, then you will not be even a little late. When your opponent is hurrying recklessly, you must act contrarily and remain calm. You must not be influenced by the opponent. Train diligently to attain this spirit. Interior and surface. In other schools there is no interior or surface in strategy. Other schools often claim inner meaning and secret tradition, and talk about the interior and gate, but in combat, there is no such thing as fighting on the surface or cutting with the interior. When I teach my way, I first teach techniques that are easy for the student to understand, a doctrine that is easy to understand. I gradually try to explain the deep principles, points that are difficult to comprehend, according to the student's progress. In any case, because understanding comes through experience, I do not speak of interior and gate. In this world, if you go into the mountains and decide to go deeper and deeper, instead you will emerge at the gate. Whatever the way, it has an interior, and it is sometimes a good thing to point out the gate. In strategy, we cannot say what is concealed and what is revealed. Accordingly, I dislike passing on my way through written pledges and regulations. Perceiving the ability of my students, I teach the direct way, remove the bad influence of other schools, and gradually introduce them to the true way of the warrior. 53. Old Pine Tree, Komatsubashi, an old tune for flute or lyre. Gate. A student enrolling in a school would pass through the gate of the dojo. To enter a teacher's gate means to take up a course of study. The method of teaching my strategy is with a trustworthy spirit. You must train diligently. I have tried to record an outline of the strategy of other schools in the above 9 sections. I could now continue by giving a specific account of these schools one by one, from the gate to the interior, but I have intentionally not named the schools or their main points. The reason for this is that different branches of schools give different interpretations of the doctrines. As men's opinions differ, there must be differing ideas on the same matter. Thus, no one man's conception is valid for any school. I have shown the general tendencies of other schools on 9 points. If we look at them from an honest viewpoint, we see that people always tend to prefer long swords or short swords and become concerned with strength in both large and small matters. You can see why I do not discuss the gates of other schools. In my Ichi school of the long sword, there is neither gate nor interior. There is no inner meaning in sword attitudes. You must simply keep your spirit true to realize the virtue of strategy. 12th day of the 5th month, the 2nd year of Shoho, 1645, Teruo Maganojo Shinman Musashi. The Book of the Void. The Anaita Ichi way of strategy is recorded in this, the Book of the Void. What is called the spirit of the void is where there is nothing. It is not included in man's knowledge. Of course, the void is nothingness. By knowing things that exist, you can know that which does not exist. That is the void. People in this world look at things mistakenly and think that what they do not understand must be the void. This is not the true void. It is bewilderment. In the way of strategy, also, those who study as warriors think that whatever they cannot understand in their craft is the void. This is not the true void. To attain the way of strategy as a warrior, you must fully study other martial arts and not deviate even a little from the way of the warrior. With your spirit settled, accumulate practice day by day and hour by hour. Polish the twofold spirit of heart and mind, and sharpen the twofold gaze of perception and sight. When your spirit is not clouded at all, when the clouds of bewilderment clear away, there is the true void. Until you understand the true path, whether in Buddhism or in common sense, you may believe that things are correct and in order. However, if we objectively examine things from the perspective of the laws of the world, we see various doctrines deviating from the true path. Understand this mindset well, and let forthrightness be the foundation and the true spirit be the path. Implement strategies broadly, correctly, and openly. Then you will begin to consider things in a broader sense and, by regarding emptiness as the path, you will perceive the path as emptiness. In emptiness lies virtue, and no evil. Wisdom exists, principles exist, the path exists, and spirit is nothingness. 12th day of the 5th month, 2nd year of Shoho, 1645, Teruo Maganojo Shinman Musashi. Original Victor Harris 1974 introduction has been moved to the epilogue. Japan during Musashi's lifetime. Miyamoto Musashi was born in 1584, in a Japan struggling to recover from more than 4 centuries of internal strife. The traditional rule of the emperors had been overthrown in the 12th century, and although each successive emperor remained the figurehead of Japan, his powers were very much reduced. Since that time, Japan had seen almost continuous civil war between the provincial lords, warrior monks and brigands, all fighting each other for land and power. In the 15th and 16th centuries the lords, called daimyo, built huge stone castles to protect themselves and their lands, and castle towns outside the walls began to grow up. These wars naturally restricted the growth of trade and impoverished the whole country. In 1573, however, one man, Oda Nobunaga, came to the fore in Japan. He became shogun, or military dictator, and for 9 years succeeded in gaining control of almost the whole of the country. When Nobunaga was assassinated in 1582, a commoner took over the government. Toyotomi Hideyoshi continued the work of unifying Japan, which Nobunaga had begun, ruthlessly putting down any traces of insurrection. He revived the old gulf between the warriors of Japan, the samurai, and the commoners by introducing restrictions on the wearing of swords. Hideyoshi's sword hunt, as it was known, meant that only samurai were allowed to wear 2 swords, the short one which everyone could wear and the long one which distinguished the samurai from the rest of the population. Although Hideyoshi did much to settle Japan and increase trade with the outside world, by the time of his death in 1598 internal disturbances still had not been completely eliminated. The real isolation and unification of Japan began with the inauguration of the Great Tokugawa rule. In 1603 Tokugawa Ieyasu, a former associate of both Hideyoshi and Nobunaga, formally became shogun of Japan, after defeating Hideyoshi's son Hideyori at the Battle of Seki-Jiehara. Ieyasu established his government at Edo, present-day Tokyo, where he had a huge castle. His was a stable, peaceful government beginning a period of Japanese history which was to last until the imperial restoration of 1868, for although Ieyasu himself died in 1616, members of his family succeeded each other and the title shogun became virtually an hereditary one for the Tokugawas. Ieyasu was determined to ensure his and his family's dictatorship. To this end, he paid lip service to the emperor in Kyoto, who remained the titular head of Japan, while curtailing his duties and involvement in the government. The real threat to Ieyasu's position could only come from the lords, and he effectively decreased their opportunities for revolt by devising schemes whereby all lords had to live in Edo for alternate years and by placing great restrictions on traveling. He allotted land in exchange for oaths of allegiance, and gave the provincial castles around Edo to members of his own family. He also employed a network of secret police and assassins. The Tokugawa period marks a great change in the social history of Japan. The bureaucracy of the Tokugawas was all-pervading. Not only were education, law, government and class controlled, but even the costume and behavior of each class. The traditional class consciousness of Japan hardened into a rigid class structure. There were basically 4 classes of person: samurai, farmers, artisans, and merchants. The samurai were the highest, in esteem if not in wealth, and included the lords, senior government officials, warriors, and minor officials and foot soldiers. Next in the hierarchy came the farmers, not because they were well thought of but because they provided the essential rice crops. Their lot was a rather unhappy one, as they were forced to give most of their crops to the lords and were not allowed to leave their farms. Then came the artisans and craftsmen, and last of all the merchants, who, though looked down upon, eventually rose to prominence because of the vast wealth they accumulated. Few people were outside this rigid hierarchy. Musashi belonged to the samurai class. We find the origins of the samurai class in the Kandai, stalwart youth, system established in 792 AD, whereby the Japanese army, which had until then consisted mainly of spear-wielding foot soldiers, was revived by stiffening the ranks with permanent training officers recruited from among the young sons of the high families. These officers were mounted, wore armor, and used the bow and sword. In 782 the Emperor Kamu started building Kyoto, and in Kyoto he built a training hall which exists to this day called the Budokyuden, meaning Hall of the Virtues of War. Within a few years of this revival the fierce Ainu, the aboriginal inhabitants of Japan, who had until then confounded the army's attempt to move them from their wild lodgings, were driven far off to the northern island, Hokkaido. When the great provincial armies were gradually disbanded under Hideyoshi and Ieyasu, many out-of-work samurai roamed the country redundant in an era of peace. Musashi was one such samurai, or renin or wave man. There were still samurai retainers to the Tokugawas and provincial lords, but their numbers were few. The hordes of redundant samurai found themselves living in a society which was completely based on the old chivalry, but at the same time they were apart from a society in which there was no place for men at arms. They became an inverted class, keeping the old chivalry alive by devotion to military arts with the fervor only Japanese possess. This was the time of the flowering in Kendo. Kendo, the way of the sword, had always been synonymous with nobility in Japan. Since the founding of the samurai class in the 8th century, the military arts had become the highest form of study, inspired by the teachings of Zen and the feeling of Shinto. Schools of Kendo born in the early Muromachi period, approximately 1390–1600, were continued through the upheavals of the formation of the peaceful Tokugawa shogunate, and survive to this day. The education of the sons of the Tokugawa shoguns was by means of schooling in the Chinese classics and fencing exercises. Where a Westerner might say the pen is mightier than the sword, the Japanese would say bunbu ichi, or pen and sword in accord. Today, prominent businessmen and political figures in Japan still practice the old traditions of kendo schools, preserving the forms of several hundred years ago. To sum up, Musashi was a renin at a time when the samurai were formally considered to be the elite, but actually had no means of livelihood unless they owned lands and castles. Many renin put up their swords and became artisans, but others, like Musashi, pursued the ideal of the warrior searching for enlightenment through the perilous paths of kendo. Duels of revenge and tests of skill were commonplace, and fencing schools multiplied. Two schools especially, the Edo school and the Yagyu school, were sponsored by the Tokugawas. The Edo school provided an unbroken line of kendo teachers, and the Yagyu school eventually became the secret police of the Tokugawa bureaucracy. Kendo. Traditionally, the fencing halls of Japan, called dojo, were associated with shrines and temples, but during Musashi's lifetime numerous schools sprang up in the new castle towns. Each daimyo or lord sponsored a kendo school, where his retainers could be trained and his sons educated. The hope of every renin was that he would defeat the students and master of a dojo in combat, thus increasing his fame and bringing his name to the ears of one who might employ him. The samurai wore two swords thrust through the belt with the cutting edge uppermost. The longer sword was carried out of doors only, the shorter sword was worn at all times. For training, wooden swords and bamboo swords were often used. Dueling and other tests of arms were common, with both real and practice swords. These took place in fencing halls and before shrines, in the streets and within castle walls. Duels were fought to the death or until one of the contestants was disabled, but a few generations after Musashi's time the shurnai, a pliable bamboo sword, and later padded fencing armor, came to be widely used, so the chances of injury were greatly reduced. The samurai studied with all kinds of weapons, halberds, sticks, swords, chain and sickle, and others. Many schools using such weapons survive in traditional form in Japan today. To train in kendo one must subjugate the self, bear the pain of grueling practice, and cultivate a level mind in the face of peril. But the way of the sword means not only fencing training but also living by the code of honor of the samurai elite. Warfare was the spirit of the samurai's everyday life, and he could face death as if it were a domestic routine. The meaning of life and death by the sword was mirrored in the everyday conduct of the feudal Japanese, and he who realized the resolute acceptance of death at any moment in his everyday life was a master of the sword. It is in order to attain such an understanding that later men have followed the ancient traditions of the sword fencing styles, and even today give up their lives for kendo practice. Kendo and Zen. The way of the sword is the moral teaching of the samurai, fostered by the Confucianist philosophy which shaped the Tokugawa system, together with the native Shinto religion of Japan. The warrior courts of Japan from the Kamakura period to the Muromachi period encouraged the austere Zen study among the samurai, and Zen went hand in hand with the arts of war. In Zen there are no elaborations, it aims directly at the true nature of things. There are no ceremonies, no teachings, the prize of Zen is essentially personal. Enlightenment in Zen does not mean a change in behavior, but realization of the nature of ordinary life. The end point is the beginning, and the great virtue is simplicity. The secret teaching of the Ito-Ryu school of Kendo, Kiryatoshi, is the first technique of some 100 or so. The teaching is Aiuchi, meaning to cut the opponent just as he cuts you. This is the ultimate timing, it is lack of anger. It means to treat your enemy as an honored guest. It also means to abandon your life or throw away fear. The first technique is the last, the beginner and the master behave in the same way. Knowledge is a full circle. The first of Musashi's chapter headings is ground, for the basis of Kendo and Zen, and the last book is void, for that understanding which can only be expressed as nothingness. The teachings of Kendo are like the fierce verbal forays to which the Zen student is subjected. Assailed with doubts and misery, his mind and spirit in a whirl, the student is gradually guided to realization and understanding by his teacher. The Kendo student practices furiously, thousands of cuts morning and night, learning fierce techniques of horrible war, until eventually sword becomes no sword, intention becomes no intention, a spontaneous knowledge of every situation. The first elementary teaching becomes the highest knowledge, and the master still continues to practice this simple training, his every prayer. Concerning the life of Miyamoto Musashi. Shinmen Musashi no Kami Fujiwara no Genshin, or as he is commonly known Miyamoto Musashi, was born in the village called Miyamoto in the province Mimasaka in 1584. Musashi is the name of an area southwest of Tokyo, and the appellation no Kami means noble person of the area, while Fujiwara is the name of the noble family foremost in Japan over 1,000 years ago. Musashi's ancestors were a branch of the powerful Harima clan in Kyushu, the southern island of Japan. Hirata Shokin, his grandfather, was a retainer of Shinmen Iga. No Kami Tsuchige, the lord of Takayama Castle. Hirata Shokin was highly thought of by his lord and eventually married his lord's daughter. When Musashi was 7, his father, Munisai, either died or abandoned the child. As his mother had died, Ben Nosuke, as Musashi was known during his childhood, was left in the care of an uncle on his mother's side, a priest. So we find Musashi an orphan. During Hideyoshi's campaigns of unification, son of a samurai in a violent unhappy land. He was a boisterous youth, strong-willed and physically large for his age. Whether he was Urged to pursue kendo by his uncle, or whether his aggressive nature led him to it, we do not know, but it is recorded that he slew a man in single combat when he was just 13. The opponent was Arima Kihei, a samurai of the Shinto Ryu school of military arts, skilled with sword and spear. The boy threw the man to the ground, and beat him about the head with a stick when he tried to rise. Kihei died vomiting blood. Musashi's next contest was when he was 16, when he defeated Tadashima Akiyama. About this time, he left home to embark on the warrior pilgrimage which saw him victor in scores of contests and which took him to war 6 times, until he finally settled down at the age of 50, having reached the end of his search for reason. There must have been many Renin traveling the country on similar expeditions, some alone like Musashi, and some enjoying sponsorship, though not on the scale of the pilgrimage of the famous swordsman Tsukahara Bokuden, who had traveled with a retinue of over 100 men in the previous century. This part of Musashi's life was spent living apart from society while he devoted himself with a ferocious single-mindedness to the search for enlightenment by the way of the sword. Concerned only with perfecting his skill, he lived as men need not live, wandering over Japan soaked by the cold winds of winter, not dressing his hair, not taking a wife, nor following any profession save his study. It is said he never entered a bathtub, lest he was caught unawares without a weapon, and that his appearance was uncouth and wretched. In the battle which resulted in Ieyasu succeeding Hideyoshi as shogun of Japan, Seiki Jiehara, Musashi joined the ranks of the Ashikaga army to fight against Ieyasu. He survived the terrible 3 days during which 70,000 people died, and also survived the hunting down and massacre of the vanquished army. He went up to Kyoto, the capital, when he was 21. This was the scene of his vendetta against the Yoshioka family. The Yoshiokas had been fencing instructors to the Ashikaga house for generations. Later forbidden to teach kendo by Lord Tokugawa, the family became dyers, and are dyers today. Munisai, Musashi's father, had been invited to Kyoto some years before by the shogun Ashikaga Yashiaka. Munisai was a competent swordsman, and an expert with the jit, a kind of iron truncheon with a tongue for catching sword blades. The story has it that Munisai fought 3 of the Yoshiokas, winning 2 of the duels, and perhaps this has some bearing on Musashi's behavior towards the family. Yoshioka Sujiro, the head of the family, was the first to fight Musashi, on the moor outside the city. Sujiro was armed with a real sword, and Musashi with a wooden sword. Musashi laid Sujiro out with a fierce attack and beat him savagely as he lay on the ground. The retainers carried their lord home on a rain shutter, where for shame he cut off his samurai topknot. Musashi lingered on in the capital, and his continued presence further irked the Yoshiokas. The second brother, Denshikiro, applied to Musashi for a duel. As a military ploy, Musashi arrived late on the appointed day, and seconds after the start of the fight he broke his opponent's skull with one blow of his wooden sword. Denshikiro was dead. The house issued yet another challenge with Hanshikiro, the young son of Sujiro, as champion. Hanshikiro was a mere boy, not yet in his teens. The contest was to be held by a pine tree adjacent to rice fields. Musashi arrived at the meeting place well before the appointed time and waited in hiding for his enemy to come. The child arrived dressed formally in war gear, with a party of well-armed retainers, determined to do away with Musashi. Musashi waited concealed in the shadows, and just as they were thinking that he had thought better of it and had decided to leave Kyoto, he suddenly appeared in the midst of them and cut the boy down. Then, drawing both swords, he cut a path through them and made his escape. After that frightful episode, Musashi wandered over Japan, becoming a legend in his own time. We find mention of his name and stories of his prowess in registers, diaries, on monuments, and in folk memory from Tokyo to Kyushu. He had more than 60 contests before he was 29, and won them all. The earliest account of his contests appears in Nitten Ki, or Two Heavens Chronicle, a record compiled by his pupils a generation after his death. In the year of the Yoshioka affair, 1605, he visited the temple Hosoin in the south of the capital. Here he had a contest with Oko Hosoin, the Nichiren sect pupil of the Zen priest Hoinane. The priest was a spearman, but no match for Musashi, who defeated him twice with his short wooden sword. Musashi stayed at the temple for some time studying fighting techniques and enjoying talks with the priests. There is still today a traditional spear fighting form practiced by the monks of Hosoin. It is interesting that in ancient times, the word asho, which now means priest, used to mean spear teacher. Hoinane was pupil to Azumi Musashi no Kami, a master of Shinto Kendo. The priest used spears with cross-shaped blades kept outside the temple under the eaves and used in firefighting. When Musashi was in Iga province, he met a skilled chain and sickle fighter named Shishido Baikin. As Shishido twirled his chain, Musashi drew a dagger and pierced his breast, advancing to finish him off. The watching pupils attacked Musashi, but he frightened them away in 4 directions. In Edo, a fighter named Muzo Ganasuk visited Musashi requesting a duel. Musashi was cutting wood to make a bow, and granting Ganasuk's request, stood up, intending to use the slender wand he was cutting as a sword. Ganasuk made a fierce attack, but Musashi stepped straight in and banged him on the head. Ganasuk went away. Passing through Izumo province, Musashi visited Lord Matsudaira and asked permission to fight with his strongest expert. There were many good strategists in Izumo. Permission was granted against a man who used an 8-foot-long hexagonal wooden pole. The contest was held in the Lord's library garden. Musashi used 2 wooden swords. He chased the samurai up the 2 wooden steps of the library veranda, thrust at his face on the second step, and hit him on both his arms as he flinched away. To the surprise of the assembled retainers, Lord Matsudaira asked Musashi to fight him. Musashi drove the lord up the library steps as before, and when he tried to make a resolute fencing attitude, Musashi hit his sword with the fire and stones cut, breaking it in 2. The lord bowed in defeat, and Musashi stayed for some time as his teacher. Musashi's most well-known duel was in the 17th year of Keicho, 1612, when he was in Ogura in Bunzen province. His opponent was Sasaki Kojiro, a young man who had developed a strong fencing technique known as tsubengeshi, or swallow counter, inspired by the motion of a swallow's tail in flight. Kojiro was retained by the lord of the province, Hosokawa Tadaoki. Musashi applied to Tadaoki for permission to fight Kojiro through the offices of one of the Hosokawa retainers who had been a pupil of Musashi's father, one Nagaoka Sato Okinaga. Permission was granted for the contest to be held at 8 o'clock the next morning, and the place was to be an island some few miles from Ogura. That night Musashi left his lodging and moved to the house of Kobayashi Terzaiman. This inspired a rumor that awe of Kojiro's subtle technique had made Musashi run away afraid for his life. The next day at 8 o'clock Musashi could not be woken until a prompter came from the officials assembled on the island. He got up, drank the water they brought to him to wash with, and went straight down to the shore. As Sato rowed across to the island, Musashi fashioned a paper string to tie back the sleeves of his kimono, and cut a wooden sword from the spare oar. When he had done this he lay down to rest. The boat neared the place of combat, and Kojiro and the waiting officials were astounded to see the strange figure of Musashi, with his unkempt hair tied up in a towel, leap from the boat brandishing the long wooden oar and rush through the waves up the beach towards his enemy. Kojiro drew his long sword, a fine blade by Nagamitsu of Bison, and threw away his scabbard. "You have no more need of that," said Musashi as he rushed forward with his sword held to one side. Kojiro was provoked into making the first cut, and Musashi dashed upward at his blade, bringing the oar down on Kojiro's head. As Kojiro fell, his sword, which had cut the towel from Musashi's head, cut across the hem of his divided skirt. Musashi noted Kojiro's condition and bowed to the astounded officials before running back to his boat. Some sources have it that after he killed Kojiro, Musashi threw down the oar and, nimbly leaping back several paces, drew both his swords and flourished them with a shout at his fallen enemy. It was about this time that Musashi stopped ever using real swords in duels. He was invincible, and from now on he devoted himself to the search for perfect understanding by way of kendo. In 1614 and again in 1615 he took the opportunity of once more experiencing warfare and siege. Ieyasu laid siege to Osaka Castle, where the supporters of the Ashikaga family were gathered in insurrection. Musashi joined the Tokugawa forces in both winter and summer campaigns, now fighting against those he had fought for as a youth at Seikijihara. According to his own writing, he came to understand strategy when he was 50 or 51 in 1634. He and his adopted son Lori, the waif whom he had met in Dua province on his travels, settled in Ogura in this year. Musashi was never again to leave Kyushu Island. The Hosokawa house had been entrusted with the command of the hot seat of Higo province, Kumamoto Castle, and the new lord of Bunzen was in Ogasawara. Lori found employment under Ogasawara Tadazane, and as a captain in Tadazane's army, fought against the Christians in the Shimawara uprising of 1638, when Ieyasu was about 55. The lords of the southern provinces had always been antagonistic to the Tokugawas and were the instigators of intrigue with foreign powers and the Japanese Christians. Musashi was a member of the field staff at Shimawara, where the Christians were massacred. After this, Ieyasu closed the ports of Japan to foreign intercourse, and they remained closed for over 200 years. After 6 years in Ogura, Musashi was invited to stay with Churl, the Hosokawa lord of Kumamoto Castle, as a guest. He stayed a few years with Lord Churi and spent his time teaching and painting. In 1643, he retired to a life of seclusion in a cave called Ryujendo. Here he wrote Go-Rin no Sho, addressed to his pupil Teruo Nobuyuki, a few weeks before his death on the 19th of May, 1645. Musashi is known to the Japanese as Kensei, that is Sword Saint. Go-Rin no Sho heads every kendo bibliography, being unique among books of martial art in that it deals with both the strategy of warfare and the methods of single combat in exactly the same way. The book is not a thesis on strategy, it is in Musashi's words a guide for men who want to learn strategy, and, as a guide always leads, so the contents are always beyond the student's understanding. The more one reads the book, the more one finds in its pages. It is Musashi's last will, the key to the path he trod. When, at 28 or 29, he had become such a strong fighter, he did not settle down and build a school, replete with success, but became doubly engrossed with his study. In his last days, even, he scorned the life of comfort with Lord Hosokawa and lived 2 years alone in a mountain cave deep in contemplation. The behavior of this cruel, headstrong man was evidently most humble and honest. Musashi wrote, "When you have attained the way of strategy, there will be not one thing that you cannot understand, and you will see the way in everything." He did, in fact, become a master of arts and crafts. He produced masterpieces of ink painting, probably more highly valued by the Japanese than the ink paintings of any other. His works include cormorants, herons, Hotel the Shinto God, dragons, birds with flowers, bird. In a dead tree, Daruma, Bodhidharma, and others. He was a fine calligrapher, evidenced by his piece Senki, war spirit. There is a small wood sculpture of the Buddhist deity Fudomayu in private hands. A sculpture of Kwannon was lost recently. He made works in metal and founded the school of sword guard makers who signed Nitin after him, see below. He is said to have written poems and songs, but none of these survive. It is said also that he was commissioned by the shogun Iemitsu to paint the sunrise over Edo Castle. His paintings are sometimes impressed with his seal, Musashi, or his Namda. Plume Nitin. Nitin means two heavens, said by some to allude to his fighting attitude. With a sword in each hand held above his head. In some places he established schools known as Nitin Ryu, and in other places called it Inmei Ryu, clear circle. He wrote Study the ways of all professions. It is evident that he did just that. He sought out not only great swordsmen but also priests, strategists, artists and craftsmen, eager to broaden his knowledge. Musashi writes about the various aspects of kendo in such a way that it is possible for the beginner to study at beginner's level and for kendo masters to study the same words on a higher level. This applies not just to military strategy, but to any situation where plans and tactics are used. Japanese businessmen have used Go-Rin no Slyo as a guide for business practice, making sales campaigns like military operations, using the same energetic methods. In the same way that Musashi seems to have been a horribly cruel man, yet was following logically an honest ideal, so successful business seems to most people to be without conscience. Musashi's life study is thus as relevant in the 20th century as it was on the medieval battleground, and applies not just to the Japanese race but to all nations. I suppose you could sum up his inspiration as humility and hard work.